Okay, well, welcome back. It's good to see you all in whatever fashion I can. As I went over in the first part, I went over the first two modules kind of to give you an idea of how I, as a teacher, am looking at these modules in relation to the review, but also maybe how you as students should be looking at these modules as you review. For this one, I'm not going to go over as extensively, sort of the functioning of each one of these modules, maybe a little bit more than I needed to in the first one. I'm going to discuss some of the aspects of some of these themes that I introduced fairly early on and that I'm trying to return to as much as I can, whether explicitly or suggestively. I guess those are the two ways of putting it. Meaning, I may explicitly say, in this module we're going to be talking about narrative. In this module we're thinking more about social scripts. In this one we're thinking about how history works, right? Those are sort of more explicit statements of fact about some of the connections that I want you to make. But other times I'm just sort of keeping those things in the background. I'm setting you up for one thing and then I'm moving into another, meaning I might start talking about narrative and then it sort of affects that idea of history, and as I talk about history it may affect the idea of narrative. But the three main things I'm going to go over this time, because I think they're probably the hardest to really consolidate down, are the idea of one, narrative, two, social scripts. I'm gonna return to that because it's been a while since we talked explicitly about it. And then the idea of history, sort of how I'm starting to use history as a tool to identify examples of what I mean when I think of narratives and social scripts. Okay, and it'll probably be a lot more clear as we go even into Blood Meridian, hopefully. Because I do want to use those concepts in the same way. And then maybe in the research, I might suggest that you revisit this again. Okay, so as for the idea of narrative, I'm going to go scroll up because I want to show you how early in the semester I started talking about narrative. It was pretty much from this point on. The introduction to the book, right after I went into social cues and social scripts, I talked in one of these videos about the idea of narrative. Essentially what I mean by narrative, without necessarily going over it again ad nauseum, is the idea that everything is sort of based on this story. Meaning history, meaning our daily actions, we're in some ways have some assumptions about sort of how things are supposed to work and what the authorized version of what we're supposed to be following is. What I mean by that is I'll use the example of history. History is told, I don't know if you've heard this term before, but history is told by the victor, right? The people that won are the ones that get to tell the history. Now, history, as an example of how narratives work, that one authorized history, meaning the one that the person that wins wants to tell you, gives you only one version of all of the facts that happened, right? That's sort of those are the most powerful narratives, the ones that aren't in competition with anything else, right? If I told you from the moment you were born to now that America was XYZ over and over again, and I authorized everybody to tell you that's teaching you history that particular history was the only history that was true, even though it's not a complete history of all of the events that have happened, it lends that narrative a tremendous power to influence how you see the world. Okay, and in that case, that one narrative, if it remains unchallenged, it's the narrative that you live with. It's a story of your place in this particular history. You don't have to get as broad as history. In some cases, maybe like Paulo Freire talks about the narrative again. And maybe in the Freire reading, that's where you probably really want to review the idea of more specific narrative. Now, I've given you sort of that broader narrative, history, and then we'll talk later about sort of how counter history works, meaning how other competitive histories can come in and sort of undermine that authorized history. But I'll leave that for most of that for Blood Meridian. But when Freire talks about narrative, he talks about the narrative of classroom and the narrative of education and the narrative of learning. Okay, so he's specifically focused mostly on that relationship that a student has when they go into a classroom. There's a narrative that they follow, meaning there's an assumption that certain things are not going to be challenged, right? And that story that you're following puts both the teacher in a role and the student in a particular role, right? You can already see kind of maybe a little bit about how that relates to social scripts, right? So when you're put in these roles, you're sort of playing out this story. The narrative of the classroom is such that the teacher is more important than the student. The student is a passive observer to the learning, and then that learning comes about because you're just sort of sitting there taking in authorized units, right, from the teacher who is authorized to give these things out, okay? So that's the narrative story, right? But more specifically, it's a narrative that takes place from the moment you walk in. It's sort of the history of the classroom and the history of learning is all embedded within that idea of everything that you encounter. So everything that you encounter in a classroom is part of that narrative. What do I mean by that? One example that I like to use is when you walk into a classroom, most regular classrooms, not now obviously because we have other things that are interrupting that narrative, right? In a normal, quote unquote, normal classroom, right, you have desks, right? And those desks take up maybe 2/3 of the classroom. When you walk in, you don't maybe make note of that because that's not really interesting or unusual, or you just sort of go and take your seat, right? Then the teacher walks in, or maybe the teacher's already there, and how much of the classroom do they get? Now, there may be reasons why they have maybe 1/3 of the classroom, right? Maybe there's like some technology that they need to utilize, or maybe, it's just more convenient. But really, if you think about it, when you're in a classroom and 2/3 of the class is taken up by 30 students, and then 1/3 of the class is taken up by a teacher, in some ways, it tells you a little bit about the importance of each one of those roles. What do I mean by that? Simple mathematics, right? How much of the room do you get as 1/30th of a student in 2/3 of the classroom versus how much room does the teacher get? 1/3, right? There's nothing really equal about that division, right? And then you also think about Freire in terms of the narrative of the classroom. The idea that the teacher is up here standing there, eloquating from his book and telling you the important things. And then you're down here kind of taking notes and looking up and, raising your hand politely. And, now obviously there's some reasons for that, in terms of order. And, there are probably legitimate ways to explain that that don't involve sort of this oppression, going into the idea of oppression. But not entirely. That is not an accident, okay? So one of the innovations with more modern education, or more maybe progressive education, however you want to think about it, is the idea that that we should disrupt that narrative, right? When we do, like say in a classroom, if I were to do group work and make people move their desks around, and then I come down and sort of visit everybody, right? That's disrupting that narrative, right? It's not just me in 1/3 of the classroom sort of lording it over this section and then not entering your space because, you had this little tiny space that you're sort of trapped in, right? I'm disrupting the narrative of a classroom, okay? So what I mean by that is that that assumption that that's the way to go and that the power relationship needs to establish itself that way by the function of the classroom is disruptive, okay? So that's a quick sort of overview of what narrative means in both the historical context and maybe even in this more specific classroom context. So you want to think about that and maybe chew on that and think about how narratives work in everyday life, okay, and how the authorized story that you're embedded within can be disrupted. Okay, that's sort of that's what critical thinking is about, right? You know, there's not just one way, authorized way to learn. You just sort of have to ask questions and all of those things that we talked about in Unit 1. The other one is social scripts. I'm not going to go over that ad nauseum because I do think that that is more of a definition. So if you look back at the acting out culture right here, social cues, maybe not building an argument, but this right here is kind of where you would go to find that idea of social scripts. Okay, so if that pops up. History. This is the third topic or theme that I want to quickly go over. I'll just see if I can see what I can cover in just a couple of minutes here. Think about how each one of these authors uses history to establish their points. That would be my advice to you. Okay, so if you're asked something about how thematically history works, for example, in the case for reparations, there's history in that, right? It establishes its argument, and then it goes into historical examples, right? So it's using history to buttress sort of its claims. So each one of those times where it dips into, you know, the history of the South, right, in a particular instance, and maybe provides an example of somebody that lived in the South. That's using history, right? How is that author using history? Is what the question should be when that comes up, because that's obviously intentional. In the case of, let me go to letter from Birmingham jail, right? He also calls to history, right? But in a different way. He doesn't use, like, you know, some guy that lives in the South, right? Because he is already living in the South, and he is trying to get a point across. But he uses history in a very different way, right? He calls back to sort of ancient texts like the Bible, right, and ancient documents to buttress his claims, right? So that's a way that history gets used. So that's another way of thinking about it too. So you might want to think about that and then play around with it in your mind a little bit, so that when you do get asked something like that, you kind of know how to start tying these things together. Okay, so hopefully that helps. Those are 3 examples of things that I have on my brain right now, and that's a good thing for me to let it off to you, because what's on my brain when I'm putting together the midterm is probably things that should be on your brain, correct? Okay, so that's what I got for you on the themes and stuff. In the next little section, I may go over a little bit more of some of the specifics of some of these readings and make this a true review, right? Okay, thank you. I'll see you in just a second.